Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer,
And I'm Krista Carmen,
and this is
Murder Coaster.
welcome back to part two of the story of Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in American history. But before we begin, I have to give a huge congratulations to my co-host, Krista, whose novel The Daughters of Block Island has won the Bram Stoker Award. A momentous achievement. I am so happy and proud of you. Tell us, how does it feel to be a Stoker Award-winning author?
Honestly, there is just a little bit of a feeling of like knowing that I made the right decision when I foolishly thought about publishing the very first novel that I ever wrote 10 years ago, and I quelled that desire and I kept working, and I realized that I didn't know how to write a novel at all, and then I focused on short fiction, and then I went back to it, and it does feel a little bit like a see, you made the right decision kind of moment. But thank you so much for your very, very generous words.
And you got a new one coming out in December?
Yes, Beneath the Poet's House. Whole bunch to do with Edgar Allan Poe and Sarah Helen Whitman, but rolled up in a modern day sort of residual haunting story. So that should be fun, and I'm sure we can spin some of our episodes to include. Maybe we can look for cases that had to do with residual hauntings or echo hauntings. That could be fun.
Yeah, and Edgar Allan Poe and all that stuff. And and listeners, send us an email if you got an idea that goes along with that theme.
Yes,
a
please.
little bird told me I'm getting an early copy of this book.
Yes, a little bird that. Wow, that was so strange. I said a little bird, and I looked out my window, and a woodpecker flew right alongside my window. So apparently that bird is holding me to my promise to you. So yes, you will be.
All right. Back to the show. In our last episode, we saw Samuel Little go from an unwanted infant, literally abandoned in the rain and mud, to a juvenile delinquent running amok, in and out of reformatories and prisons, eventually becoming a nomadic serial killer, crisscrossing the country for decades, leaving as many as 93 women dead in his wake. Today we tell you the bizarre details of his capture and confessions, and the wild cast of characters that came together to bring justice for his victims. It is just a wild and crazy story. Ladies and gentlemen, we bring you Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in American history, Part 2.
Let's begin. Chapter 1. Mitzy. Long before she was a legendary LAPD homicide detective, back when she was just a Southern California girl surfing and bartending, Mitzy Roberts was a true crime fanatic and obsessed with serial killers. Working the night shift as a manager in a Los Angeles diner, cops would come staggering in looking for a bite to eat or a drink to ease the tension, and Mitzy would discuss all of the latest cases with them, telling them how she'd always dreamed of chasing down the bad guys and putting them behind bars where they couldn't hurt anyone. One night, one of the cops she was talking to suggested she apply for the LAPD, telling her they were actively looking for new recruits. So she did. Her application was accepted, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Her first job was investigating gang crimes in the San Fernando Valley. And then she was reassigned to the overnight shift in the Rampart Division, which is actually seen by many cops as a form of punishment or as a means of weaning out the weak.
Traversing the hierarchy of the LAPD, which is often seen as a boys' club, was a bit of an uphill battle for Mitzy. But she proved tenacious and not only persevered, but flourished, saying about her ascent rising up through the ranks, quote, I've always been that type that can sort of move on and adapt to the personality that I'm dealing with, end quote.
And in 2000, after 5 years of working for the Los Angeles police force, Mitzy passed the detective's exam and landed herself a treasured spot in the robbery homicide division, becoming one of the first women assigned to the elite unit.
But the unit was far from a bastion of inclusiveness. When talk of hiring another woman was discussed, her lieutenant was quick to say, right in front of her,
"Well, she ain't coming on my squad. I have my female."
Despite the misogyny, Mitzy won over her colleagues in robbery homicide with both her hard work and her sense of humor. As her partner, Tim Marcia, recalls,
You had old crusty homicide detectives, and Mitzi would walk in and she would get the cat calls and the, "Hey, baby, come over here." And maybe it was because she was a bartender before she came on, but she just knows how to keep things moving.
Detective Mitzy Roberts loved working cold cases, not letting victims be forgotten, going over the clues, trying to decipher the events, putting the puzzle pieces together to discern the narrative. As she said, quote, "Opening a cold case is like opening a good book. The story is in there somewhere, if you know how to work backwards from the end," end quote.
Working under a grant from the National Institute of Justice, the LAPD established a cold case special section which screened DNA evidence from cases which had previously been considered unsolvable. There were thousands of these cases, many from the 1980s and 90s, when the crack epidemic raged and South Central Los Angeles became a playground for serial killers like Lonnie Franklin, Chester Turner, Michael Hughes, and Richard Ramirez.
So old evidence in unsolved homicides was combed over and sent for DNA testing. And in April of 2012, a federal database showed a case-to-case DNA match connecting two women murdered in 1989, Audrey Nelson and Guadalupe Apodaca, suggesting they'd both been killed by the same man. And there was a match to the DNA itself as well. A man named Samuel Little.
Mitzy was dumbstruck reading Samuel Little's 100-page arrest record. Theft, burglary, rape, even murder. It was insane. The former boxer had repeatedly attacked prostitutes, drug addicts, and other vulnerable women in 19 states over the course of 35 years. But despite being arrested in Florida and Mississippi for murder, no one had been able to keep him locked up. And an arrest in San Diego on attempted murder somehow resulted in only a short prison sentence for assault, just 18 months. And though now he would be elderly, he was still out there somewhere. And Mitzy felt he could still be killing. She needed to find this man and get him off the streets. As she said,
he had such a hatred for women, and he was preying on the weakest women, what society would consider throwaway women. But everyone counts or nobody counts.
She spoke with investigators in Florida, Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio, Oregon, and Texas, trying to track him down, all to no avail. Her captain suggested they release a wanted flyer, but she was against it. He was afraid that if he saw a flyer and realized that he was a wanted man, he'd disappear forever.
She was able to uncover a 2007 outstanding narcotics warrant for Little. A very minor thing, but something she could use as a means of detaining him if he could be found. But he proved incredibly elusive, moving like a ghost, living out of his car, crashing in homeless shelters and seedy flop houses. Quote, "We were always 2 days behind him," end quote, she said, and her superior's interest was beginning to wane, as they came to believe he'd never be caught.
But through dogged investigative work, Mitzy was able to determine that he was having his Social Security payments deposited onto an anonymous Walmart card that was currently being used in a liquor store in Kentucky, situated right next to a homeless shelter. She dispatched U.S. Marshals to the shelter, and within hours, they had Samuel Little in handcuffs.
And when they brought him in and she ran her cases through the FBI's VICAP system, she got another DNA hit. Carol Alford, murdered in Los Angeles in 1987.
In January of 2013, Assistant District Attorney Beth Silverman filed 3 charges of murder against him. Samuel denied everything, saying DNA proved nothing. Even if he had been with the women, he said it didn't prove he killed them. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
During his trial, he was insolent, obstinate, callous, basically just a total asshole. While family members and loved ones of the victims read impact statements about the loss of their loved ones, he shouted rude remarks, asking to make his own statement to the victims' families. Instead of owning up to his crimes and apologizing, he instead said,
"This conviction was brought on by lies and liars."
He was ultimately found guilty on all 3 first-degree counts of murder on September 2nd, 2014, and given 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Detective Mitzy saying that in the end, it was a group of powerful women who took him down.
Now he was 74 years old, an elderly man in a wheelchair, but little did anyone realize that this man was, in fact, the most prolific serial killer in American history. He harbored a terrible secret: 93 women dead at his hand, leaving countless family members and loved ones with no closure.
Detective Mitzy Roberts was sure he had more victims out there, felt it in her bones that there were families who needed closure and healing, but it was out of her hands now. Her job was to investigate cold cases in Los Angeles. She just hoped someone out there would follow up, get the story out there.
And in the end, 2 people would step up to bat. 2 people that were as different can be. A straight-laced Texas Ranger named James Holland and a wild at heart writer named Jillian Lauren.
Chapter 2. Jillian.
Jillian Lauren. What a character. Oh man, we could do a whole podcast just about her and her wild wildlife, but we're just going to give you a fairly quick breakdown. It's nuts.
Jillian Lauren was born in Chicago to a young ballerina on August 16, 1973. And her original name was Mariah, but just months later, through what she describes as a gray market adoption, she was taken in by a stockbroker and his wife in West Orange, New Jersey, and her name was changed to Jillian after her new mother's old friend who helped arrange the adoption. Later, the lawyer who put the arrangement together would be disbarred, prosecuted, and imprisoned for arranging these underground adoptions.
From the very beginning, little Jillian was a handful and a wild child with a love of drama and a flair for the arts, and much too much for her upper middle class, respectable Jewish parents. By 9, she was obsessed with true crime, triggered by Nancy Drew books given to her by her grandmother, and soon she was obsessing over Helter Skelter and the Manson family. And like all of us Gen Xers, or most of us, she discovered punk rock at a young age, blaring fast, hard music from her bedroom stereo, dyeing her hair every conceivable color, dragging her mom to the weird punk rock store to buy her Doc Martens and spiked wristbands. And her Jewish mother did not appreciate the irony and shock value that the early punks found with swastikas. I can understand that concern. Then Julian was off to see the Grateful Dead, getting high on LSD, losing her virginity at a very young age.
Unfortunately, her antics were met with violence by her father at times, which came to a head when she was 16 and he grabbed her by the throat, slamming her against the wall and backhanding her. It was then that Jillian knew she had to leave and began making plans to move from New Jersey to New York City.
At just 16 years old, Jillian was accepted to NYU's Tisch School of the Arts through an early admission program and was off to the Big Apple, where she wanted to become an actress and dancer. The wild playground of Manhattan proved too much of a pool, and she quit school just 6 months later, telling her family that she was now a student at the School of Life. But her father was not amused, and he cut her off completely financially.
On her own now, at just 16, she found work as a cocktail waitress at the Red Lion on Bleecker Street. But New York City is very expensive, as everyone knows, and waitressing just wasn't cutting it. So, using her love of dancing, she began to strip at the Cat Club on 52 and Broadway, and was soon performing at the Peepland, the Baby Doll, and Max Fish as well.
For 2 years, she worked as an exotic dancer. And when she turned 18, she was offered a job as an escort at the Crown Club, an elite agency for high paid prostitutes.
Like everything in Jillian's life, she saw this as a great experience, romanticized it, and leapt right into life as an elite escort. And though she tends to romanticize everything, she doesn't sugarcoat it, stating plainly that she went from stripper to hooker.
But her aspirations to be a dancer and actress, possibly even playwright, never faded. While pursuing a career as an actor, appearing in what she described as the worst vampire film ever made, she also dreamed of going to Paris, of reading Rimbaud in tiny cafes, of strolling the left bank and fraternizing with other bohemians. She even bought tapes to teach herself French, but she was going to need some real money to get to Europe. And when a wild opportunity to make a large amount of money revealed itself, she went for it.
Jillian was given the opportunity to be a guest of Prince Geoffrey of Brunei, the finance minister of his brother, the Sultan, who was the richest man in the world.
Just laughing, Prince Geoffrey. It just sounds ridiculous to me.
It does sound really lame.
Brunei is a Malay Muslim monarchy on the coast of Borneo. There, Jillian would be part of a large group of party girls who'd entertain the prince and his friends. She was promised a minimum of $20,000, but was told the real amount would be much, much higher and include jewelry and designer clothing as well.
She was flown to Singapore and then to the Bandar Seri Begawan Airport. From there, she was whisked off to a compound the size of a small city, through guardhouses and gates, and to a circle of guest houses with tennis courts and swimming pools, the Sultan's palace perched on a hill in the distance.
Every night, Jillian would be taken in a golf cart with several other women to the palace for a lavish party. The prince, who liked to be called Robin, would sit and watch, flanked by his favorite girl of the day, as his friends danced and partied. The women at the parties were flown in from all over the world, and the parties were like a competitive reality TV show, like Survivor for sex workers. All the girls vying for the prince's attention and affection, and sometimes getting downright cutthroat in order to get it.
Jillian played along with their weird games, using her wit and intelligence, managing to charm the prince a bit. He'd take off and have sex with her in various pleasure rooms with massive beds and black silk sheets, video cameras positioned about. He shared her with his brother as well. She went along with it all, willingly playing their games.
Reading her memoir, I kept asking myself why she fell into the weird game of trying to please this like literal child of nepotism and privilege. You know, she really was like trying so hard. I mean, she was a punk rocker, like a rebel, and now she's letting this jerk degrade her for money, playing all these head games. But, you know, she saw herself as some kind of like undercover spy. And she also saw the glamour in it and the daring. So I can see it. She was having fun and in the end getting what she wanted.
But eventually, it all got to be too much for her, and she bailed on the scene. She was paid quite well, given a box of money, heaps of jewelry, and suitcases full of designer clothes.
Back in New York, she pursued her dreams of being an actress, performing in the play Samuel's Major Problems, and hobnobbing with Manhattan's eccentric writers, actors, artists, and weirdos. She briefly even returned to Brunei, spending her 20th birthday there. But the magic was gone, and though he apparently didn't say anything about it, the prince didn't seem too enamored with the elaborate tattoos she had gotten around and apparently inside of her vagina, including teeth.
What's that horror movie called? Is it called Teeth? What's the
Yeah,
horror
there's
movie?
that one. Yeah,
I
teeth. That's
think
a
that's the
great
one I'm
movie.
thinking of.
I guess that really truly is an ancient fear and
Oh,
something
yeah.
you hear about. Yeah.
And during this time, Jillian was developing her voice as a storyteller, writing short stories, journaling, sketching out plays and novels, eventually heading across the country to San Francisco to pursue a career as a writer.
Meanwhile, the shit was hitting the fan for Prince Jeffrey, or Robin, as he liked to be called. He'd been the finance minister for the entire country. And in 1997, when the Asian financial crisis happened, his books were audited and he was found to have embezzled $14.8 billion. It's just mind boggling. How can you embezzle nearly 15 billion dollars and no one even noticed? It's crazy. And he was somehow able to avoid prosecution, but he had to give up all of his personal holdings, including the New York Palace Hotel, Hotel Bel Air in Los Angeles, and Plaza Athénée in Paris. He owned all those things.
And on top of all that, a former Miss USA named Shannon Marketic claimed she had been flown out to his lavish parties under completely false pretenses, not realizing she was basically to be a sex slave to the prince, a part of his harem, to be shared with friends and siblings. Quite the scandal.
And for a while, Jillian wasn't doing too well either. In San Francisco, she became a heroin addict, hitting rock bottom when her boyfriend grabbed her by the neck and attempted to strangle her, leaving her for dead when she passed out.
But hope is eternal, and the violence she suffered was a wake-up call. She moved to Los Angeles, where she settled down and wrote and wrote and wrote, getting a master's degree in creative writing from Antioch University and writing articles for New York Magazine, the Paris Review, the New York Times, Vanity Fair, Los Angeles Magazine, Elle, Flaunt Magazine, The Rumpus, and Salon, as well as the Moth Anthology and True Tales of Lust and Love.
She met Scott Schreiner, the bass player for Weezer. The two fell in love and married and adopted two Ethiopian boys. She wrote a memoir about her time as a stripper and escort in New York City and her exploits in the harem of Prince Jeffrey, a book called Some Girls, which became a New York Times bestseller. It's actually a really well-written and fun book. Obviously, crazy story. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, if we haven't said it enough on the podcast before, let us reiterate here. Jillian Lauren is just a fantastic writer. She really has a gift. So definitely check out all her work. And then, as she was doing research for a mystery novel, she interviewed Detective Mitzy Roberts, who told her about Samuel Little, and her life would take another bizarre turn.
Chapter 3, Mr. Sam. Being a lifelong true crime freak, Jillian was surprised she'd never heard of this serial killer, Samuel Little, and she began to research him. Flabbergasted to see he'd been arrested in 23 states and had a rap sheet over 100 pages long. which included assault and even murder. She was intrigued and set about writing an article about him for New York Magazine.
As we discussed in the opening to part one, Jillian and Sam corresponded through letters. He wholeheartedly proclaiming his innocence the entire time, and eventually she visited him in prison. He kept up his denials, but then suddenly told her he wanted a television set. And when she told him she wanted the truth, he began to spill, confessing to murder after murder after murder, beginning way back in 1970.
Jillian was floored. She also couldn't help but feel a deep kinship to these women, nearly all of them sex workers, which she had been, and all of them strangled to death. She knew what it was like to have a man put his hands around your throat. She'd experienced it with her father when she was just 16, and then in San Francisco with her junkie boyfriend who'd nearly killed her.
Sam gave her horrifying and bizarre details, telling her how he'd roamed the country with a woman named Jean who'd once tap danced in the circus, how they went from state to state, constantly on the move, almost like a depraved and twisted Jack Kerouac novel, with stories like this one.
We stopped in Omaha, where I met this little Indian girl. I'd never met an Indian and was intrigued. Bought her a few drinks. Her friends told her not to leave with me, but she did anyway. When she put her head back and let me put my hands around her neck, that was a signal of permission, a signal that she wanted to enter another world, another realm. I left her body in a barrel.
Within a month, Samuel Little had told Jillian of 24 murders.
Jillian worked compiling her notes, getting names, dates, cities, as much information as she could. Even little things like what song was playing on the radio, what the air smelled like, all clues to the when and where of these murders.
It was a laborious process, as tape recorders weren't allowed in the visiting room, so everything had to be written by hand. And though she could record phone conversations, he wouldn't admit anything on the phone, saying,
"If you want to hear my secrets, come down here and look me in the eye while I tell them. You know I got a secret, but I don't want to say nothing about it on the telephone. I'll see you when you get down here."
Once she felt she had enough details and had a fairly organized list, she contacted Mitzy, telling her, "He's talking to me, confessing," asking Mitzy what she should do with the information she'd gathered.
This shit is so Silence of the Lambs. It's crazy.
Mitzy explained that there was now someone in law enforcement who'd taken up the task of tracking down all of Samuel Little's victims, someone that had also gotten Sam to talk to them. He was a Texas Ranger named James Holland. Mitzy told Jillian she'd have him contact her.
Sam Little had mentioned Texas Ranger Holland to Jillian before, calling him a, quote, cowboy from Mars, and saying that Holland, or Jimmy, as he called him, and Jillian were the only friends he had in the whole world.
Texas Ranger James Holland quickly called Jillian, catching her off guard. She told him she didn't have her notes completely ready, that she was still compiling them. He told her to just tell him about the murders. So she began, beginning with the first one, a woman named Mary in a bar on New Year's 1970.
Yeah, he told her. Got that one. Next.
So she told him another.
Yeah, got that one. Next.
And another.
Yeah, keep them coming. Yeah, next.
Until finally she told him about the Native American woman that Sam told her he had murdered in Omaha, Nebraska, leaving her body stuffed in a barrel.
Wait. Say that one again.
1973, Omaha, Nebraska, a Native American woman left in a barrel.
I don't know that one. I'll call you back. And he immediately hung up on her. When Texas Ranger James Holland called Jillian back, her life was altered forever, and she would embark on a 2-year journey that traversed the darkest depths of humanity.
Hello?
Jillian, it's Holland. Talked to people in Omaha. They found the case. Unsolved strangulation of a woman in 1973, body found in a barrel. She was 34 years old from Rosebud Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Name Agatha White Buffalo. Good job. Congratulations, you solved a murder.
Jillian was stunned. She'd solved a murder, something she'd dreamed of doing since she was a little girl reading Nancy Drew books. And now this connection with these women, these victims of Samuel Little, grew even stronger. How many more were there? How many families having no idea who killed their loved ones or why? She became determined to tell these women's stories, to not let them be forgotten. It would become an obsession and eclipse her life.
But before we go there, let's take a look at this Texas Ranger James Holland, whom, like everyone else in this story, is larger than life, like something straight out of a movie.
Chapter 4: The Cowboy from Mars. Texas Ranger James Holland stands 6'3", wears a Stetson hat and cowboy boots, and carries a 1911 ivory-handled .45 pistol. He has his own Wikipedia page full of accolades, and is revered as a legend by many. But as we'll see, not all consider him a hero.
James Holland grew up outside of Chicago and graduated from the University of Louisville in 1993. In 1995, he joined the Texas Department of Public Safety as a highway patrol trooper and made lieutenant and then served security detail for George Bush when he was Texas governor. He became the state criminal interdiction coordinator, responsible for the state interdiction program and an instructor at the El Paso Intelligence Center. In 2008, after 13 years in law enforcement, he became a Texas Ranger, which he considered the pinnacle of law enforcement. After Ranger School, he was stationed in Fort Worth, and in 2015, he was assigned to solve cold cases throughout Texas.
He developed a system for getting murderers to confess, developing a reputation for this. Eventually, he'd become known as the serial killer whisperer.
He'd buddy up with suspects, pretend to be their friend, cajole them, butter them up, tell them he understood, get on their level. He'd deprive them of sleep, lie to them, hound them, torture them, then reward them, give them cigarettes and soda pop and pizza. Then he'd tell them to say they were sorry. Not about anything in particular, just say you're sorry, which always seemed to break them. His first big case, the one that put him on the map, was the decade-old murder of Bobby Sue Hill.
Bobby Sue Hill was a 29-year-old widow and mother of 5 who'd found herself addicted to drugs and turning to sex work to survive. She'd been found dead in a creek bed under a bridge by a group of children in 2005.
And in 2015, working from a tip he'd received, Ranger Holland narrowed his sights on a 56-year-old Air Force veteran and grandfather named Larry Driscoll. Ranger Holland worked his magic, cajoling him, lying to him, getting him to say he was sorry, and the old grandfather cracked and confessed.
Well, sort of confessed. He says he had no memory of the event, but said it must be true if everything the stalwart and stoic Texas Ranger was telling him was true. A Texas Ranger wouldn't lie, and if he said he killed her, he must have.
Larry Driscoll ended up pleading no contest, not admitting to guilt, but saying he couldn't remember doing anything like that and didn't think he'd done it, but that the state's evidence was just too much to argue against. And he was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
Ranger Holland was celebrated and started a program that provided instruction for agencies, including the Department of Justice and Defense, DEA, IRS, and the FBI, teaching them all this way of interrogating criminals, getting their confidence, then breaking them and getting them to confess.
There was only one problem. This method was perfect for eliciting false confessions. And to a lot of people, it looked very much like Larry Driscoll was a completely innocent man who'd been lured into a false confession. The Innocence Project took up his case and found none of the evidence had even been tested for DNA. And that, besides the strange illicit confession, there was no real evidence. And although Larry Driscoll never showed any remorse or owned up to the murder, he was quietly granted parole and let out of prison, a move most saw as a means of sweeping the whole mess under the rug.
But Larry Driscoll wouldn't be the only innocent man Ranger Holland convinced to confess to a murder they did not commit. After the Driscoll confession, Holland turned to the unsolved 1997 murder of 20-year-old Shebaniah Sarah Dougherty, who had disappeared after working her shift at a video store. Her body later discovered in a wooded area.
This time, Holland set his eye on a man named Christopher Axe, lying right to his face and telling him that his DNA was on the body, that he was obviously guilty, telling him he understood. It was all right. All men secretly wanted to kill women. And somehow eliciting a confession from him as well, only to have the actual DNA come back to an earlier suspect that had since died in a car accident.
With DNA evidence proving his innocence, his case against Christopher Axe was completely dropped, and Christopher would later say that Ranger Holland was a, quote, fucking idiot, and that he doesn't know how he ever became a Texas Ranger.
There is an amazing podcast all about Ranger Holland. It's called Just Say You're Sorry, which is what he would say to the people. Yeah. Check it out if this sounds interesting to you. It's very thorough. It's a deep dive, like 4 or 5 hours long. It's great podcast. Lots of interviews.
Back to our story. In Odessa, Texas, a woman named Denise Brothers had been murdered in 1994. She was a mother of 2 who had escaped an abusive marriage, and like many of these women, had fallen into drug addiction and prostitution.
At this point, Ranger Holland has a lot of friends in the FBI, and he gets wind of this Samuel Little and how the FBI believes he could be responsible for a lot of murders. Using his extensive rap sheet, they'd been able to track some of his movements back and forth across the country, and they were able to track Samuel Little to Odessa, Texas in 1994, right when Denise Brothers had been killed.
So Texas Ranger Holland set his sights on Samuel Little, flying out to California and working his magic on the elderly killer in a wheelchair. He buttered him up, told him crude jokes. He had learned from Detective Mitzy that Little did not like to be called a rapist, so Ranger Holland just called him a killer, giving Sam something he could live with, even be proud of in some sick way.
Holland told Sam that if he agreed to come to Texas for interviews, he'd fly him in style on the Texas Ranger's personal jet, get him a nice, comfortable cell with his own television, have local barbecue, grits, and milkshakes served up to him, as well as much Dr. Pepper as he could drink, and peanut M&Ms, which were his favorite.
As usual, Ranger Holland lied, telling Sam he'd guarantee the death penalty was off the table if he confessed. Finally, Sam agreed to come out, but only if he could put the guarantee of no death penalty in writing. So Ranger Holland, who in reality had never even talked to anyone in the district attorney's office, called Texas and explained his situation.
District Attorney Bobby Bland was reluctant to take the death penalty off the table and said, "Well, that's a pretty tall order to do blindly."
Ranger Holland was a master manipulator, however, and somehow schmoozed the DA into writing him a letter guaranteeing the death penalty was off the table. He just, poof, makes these things happen.
But Samuel Little was a master manipulator as well. And after being flown to Texas in a jet, taken to the Wise County Jail and being served barbecue, being coddled and cajoled, he refused to confess, saying simply, "Those dogs, I ain't saying shit. This is bullshit. I ain't telling you fucking nothing. Those lying bastards, fucking cops, they set me up. It was the Mexican mafia killed that bitch. I can't even pronounce her name."
But Ranger Holland, as we've seen, was tenacious and incredibly patient. He became what Samuel needed: a buddy, a pal, a friend, as well as a conspirator. They traded crude jokes, degraded women, exchanged raunchy tales. Ranger Holland worked him like a wind-up toy, and eventually Sam began to talk. Holland asked him how he'd done it, saying, "Come on, just tell me, I want to know." And Sam saying,
"They was broke and homeless, walked right into my spider web."
From that point on, Samuel Little began to talk, confessing to the murder of Denise Brothers, giving details only the killer would know, like the fact that she was wearing dentures.
For the next 45 days, Samuel Little would sit with Ranger Holland, the cowboy from Mars, eating pizza and drinking soda pop, laughing and slapping their thighs as they talked about murder after murder after murder after murder in Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Ohio, Texas, California, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, Georgia, Kentucky, Arizona, on and on and on.
Chapter 5: The City of Angels. Jillian was determined to identify more of these women whom she couldn't help but feel a kinship with. She felt they needed justice, and the only way to get it was to listen to the disturbing rants of Samuel Little, the words often echoing in her head long into the night, infiltrating her dreams.
"I was like a lion in the jungle, so we going hunting then, and I love women's so hungrily that I could take what I wanted. I wanted to eat her. I wanted to bite her thighs and listen to her beg, 'Please, sorry.'"
Just like Texas Ranger Holland became what Sam needed, so too did Jillian. While Holland became his buddy, his pal, who he could tell crude jokes to, Jillian became his mother, his daughter, and his ultimate victim, whatever it took to keep him talking to her.
"Some of the things I desire are disgusting. I like the slow strangulation to watch the struggle for air. I wasn't into killing. I was into getting sexual stimulation out of strangling."
She let him play out his fantasies on her. Some very innocent, considered himself a stoic figure, like something from a Hemingway novel. And he'd flirt with her by saying things like,
"I've reserved us a seat at Rick's Cafe,"
referring to the classic film Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart, and he saw himself as a character in a Bogart movie. But there was always a dark side, for he also saw himself as painter Geoffrey Carroll, whom Bogart played in the noir classic The Two Mrs. Carrolls, where he strangles Barbara Stanwyck. There was always an edge of murder to everything he told her.
"I see that woman with the big ass, the big thighs, the big titties winking her eyes at me, made me hungry like a lion. And as soon as I felt the neck, I got rock hard. The bones in her throat are what excited me."
Jillian began to see there were three Sams. There was three-card Monty Sam. This was the huckster, the con artist, putting on a show to both entertain and fool you, a trickster. Then there was who she called the perv grandpa Sam. This was the funny but dirty old man, a comedic figure, inappropriate and gross, but relatively harmless. And then there was the snake monster. This was the real Sam, the soulless psychopath that he kept hidden, the killer that would only reveal himself in terrifying fits of anger and sexual aggression.
Jillian says she made a deal with the devil. And in this deal, she promised Samuel Little that he would not die alone.
A forlorn promise, a lie, really, for everyone dies alone. But there was still a bargain in there, a pound of flesh to be had, for she'd be with him to the end. She promised to talk to him every day until the day he died, to be at his beck and call, as long as he promised to tell her the truth. To which Sam told her,
I own you now. You are mine until the end of time. Just me and you until the end.
For the truth, Jillian promised to never judge him and never leave him. And if she did something to irritate him, he'd give her home phone number to one of his loyal fans, who'd call her and harass her. And she was a journalist. She had to take calls, couldn't change her number. She would just have to deal with it.
You will be with me forever, whether you like it or not.
Chapter 6. Alice. Do you remember Alice? When you strangled her? Can you tell me about that?
Yes, she was a real nice-looking black woman. Thin, dark-skinned. She wore glasses. And her neck was thin like a swan. We were sitting there in that field. I pulled out there in that field and we were sitting down and talking in the back of the van. And she was smoking her rock cocaine. And I was too. She let me play with her throat. Kissed her mouth. Was holding her throat. Choking her.
Did she say anything?
The only thing she did then was struggle in my arms. She squirmed around, and we was looking in each other's eyes until she didn't breathe no more. She was gone. She was dead, and I just did what I wanted to her. I ran my hands through her hair. I smelled her hair. I was kissing her and holding her.
Samuel Little told Jillian Lauren how he'd met a woman named Alice at a hotel on 55th and Central in Los Angeles. He said he dumped her body by an overpass on Central Avenue. There are only two overpasses on Central, the 105 and the 91. Sam also said he remembered seeing a newspaper article about the incident, that a bicyclist had found the body. Jillian scoured papers, scrolling through microfiche in dusty library basements, but could find nothing.
But walking the streets, interviewing folks who had lived in the neighborhood at the time, deploying all her best detective work, Jillian did manage to locate the hotel, which was now a hardware store, and showed photos to Sam, who confirmed that was the place they'd met and that they'd smoked crack in the alley out back. But he didn't recognize either of the overpasses, and he kept saying he'd gone out by the beach, that he'd seen signs for the beach. But Central Avenue didn't go towards the beach. It did, however, lead towards a completely different city, 10 miles away, called Long Beach. And when she checked the papers there, sure enough, she found a tiny paragraph in the back pages of the LA Times that read,
June 12th, 1991. Woman's body found near Blue Line tracks. A man walking with his wife and child near the Metro Rail Blue Line in Long Beach stumbled across the body of a woman Monday night. The man, whose name was not released, was walking his bicycle while accompanied by his wife and small child.
there's always fucking children involved with finding these bodies.
I know, it's horrifying.
It really is. She went to the location, a dismal area covered in graffiti. and found there was indeed an overpass there. Could this be the place? Could Sam and Alice, high on crack, have driven into Long Beach, the miles just flashing by until they were in a different city altogether? Sam only remembering the signs that said the word beach. And when she asked Sam if that was a possibility, he thought it over and said, yeah, they could easily have done that drive. In fact, now he felt sure of it. Sure, that's what had happened. And when he saw the photographs Jillian had taken of the overpass, he confirmed, yes, that was definitely the spot. She had found it.
Jillian gave the information to Rick Jackson, a retired LAPD detective who contacted Long Beach police about the woman. They confirmed, yes, it was still an unsolved case. She was a thin, attractive Black woman, 35 years old, with a record for prostitution, who had been strangled to death, and her name was Alice Duval. Jillian had done it again. She'd solved another murder.
If you watch the documentary Confronting a Serial Killer, you can see the moment that Jillian is told she's solved this case. It's like extremely emotional. She's hugging one of her assistants and they're all crying. It's a beautiful moment in a sea of darkness.
Epilogue. And so there he was, this serial killer, this monster, who destroyed so many lives, now in many ways living his best life. He had friends like Holland who egged him on, sharing dirty jokes with him, buying him milkshakes and barbecue. He's got Jillian, both a daughter and mother figure, who swore she'd never judge him and always be there for him, and who also, in so many ways, was his final victim.
America's most prolific serial killer. Now an old man, living an easy life. He doesn't have to worry about where he's going to sleep at night. He doesn't have to struggle to eat. He's given free health care, all the art supplies he wants, drawing his victims, fantasizing over their deaths, warm and cozy in his cell with his own television. Is it fair?
That's up for you to decide, dear listeners. We're just the storytellers. We have no answers to deep existential questions like this, but we can say that in a truly fair and just world, those women wouldn't have been having to sell their bodies to the night to begin with, and police wouldn't have considered them the less dead, not worthy of real investigation. As Detective Mitzy Roberts says, quote, "Everyone counts. If one doesn't count, no one counts," end quote.
And as for Samuel Little, well, fighter Dostoevsky said, society should not be judged by how it treats its outstanding members, but how it treats its criminals. And Nelson Mandela would later echo this sentiment by saying, no one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails. And when it comes to the justice system, or justice in general, the world over from the beginning of time, remember that while Texas Ranger Holland may have solved all these murders, he also potentially put a completely innocent man in prison and destroyed his life. And oftentimes, for every Samuel Little we see in prison, there's a Larry Driscoll or a Christopher Axe there as well.
And as for Jillian, the woman who Samuel Little considered his final victim, his perfect victim, it had all taken a deep toll on her, put her in bleak and horrible places, forced her to relive past traumas, and his words were always there, echoing in her head, infiltrating her dreams.
I asked you to be mine forever. Nobody else, just you and me forever.
And it had had an effect on her family as well. For, as her husband said,
we're murdered out. The effects on her have just been devastating. She has to emotionally go to a place that would destroy most humans. And even though she's one of the toughest people I've ever met, It's ruinous.
But Jillian had always been a fighter, also been a survivor all her life. She was tough, and she wasn't going to let Samuel Little hurt her. As she herself said, quote, "I'm not scared of Sam Little, and it's not because he can't or doesn't want to hurt me, because he does. Of course he does. He said as much to me. But I'm not scared of him because I won't be. I just won't be. I refuse to be. He thrives off of women's fear, and I won't give it to him."
But it would all come to an end soon enough. For in the spring of 2020, the COVID-19 virus spread across the world. A global pandemic, shutting down whole infrastructures of society, ravishing and laying waste to the elderly and those with preconditioning diseases, both of which categories Samuel Little fit into.
And after only serving 6 years in prison, Samuel Little died, unable to breathe as his lungs were ravished by COVID, suffocating to death. A death not unlike that of his many, many victims.
The FBI, using information gleaned by both Jillian and Ranger Holland, would definitively confirm 63 of the 93 murders Samuel Little confessed to, making him by far the most prolific killer in American history.
And Mitzy Roberts would become immortalized as Renee Ballard, the newest protagonist of Michael Connelly's best-selling novels, a homicide detective who loved surfing and solving cold cases.
And just a few weeks ago, Mitzy actually retired from the LAPD, moving on in a new direction with her life. We wish you the best, Mitzy.
And Texas Ranger Holland retired as well, though his legacy is clouded with controversy.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Samuel Little, America's most prolific serial killer.
We hope you enjoyed this series, and be sure to tune in next week as we bring you more tales of murder and mayhem here on The Murder Coaster.
And congratulations to Krista again on winning the Stoker. So amazing. Yay.
Thank you, yes.
And read the book. We will put a link to it in the show notes.
Thanks so much.
And we want to hear from you. You got a case we should cover? Did we get something wrong? You just want to say hi? Drop us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much. Bye.